The murder of John Lennon in December 1980 sent shockwaves around the world. 1980 was also a crucial year for Lennon, who'd emerged from a 5-year hiatus ready to make music once again. This is what the final 12 months of John Lennon's life were like. In 1975, 5 tumultuous years after the breakup of the Beatles, Lennon and his second wife Yoko Ono withdrew from the public eye. This was to concentrate on raising his second son, Sean. Lennon had made many mistakes in the raising of his first child, Julian, who was born in 1963 at the height of Beatlemania. In attempting to raise Julian, John was often absent and emotionally distant, as interviews from the last year of his life addressed candidly. Lennon had worked non-stop throughout his 20s in the Beatles and had claimed that every moment of the band members' lives were planned out for them, especially while they were on the touring circuit. But the early 70s hadn't allowed for much time to slow down either. Lennon had pursued a successful solo career, starting with the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band in 1970. He contributed music to albums by Ringo Starr, collaborated with Elton John in 1974 on Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and co-wrote and performed on David Bowie's Fame in 1975. With the birth of Sean, though, Lennon withdrew from the music that had dominated his life. He claimed in his final interview with Rolling Stone that he didn't write a single song for 5 years.
Stay in bed and grow your hair. Thank you.
In his return to the limelight in fall of 1980, John Lennon explained that since the birth of Sean, he had taken up the role of house husband. In an interview with Playboy, Lennon explained, "It was more important to face myself and to face that reality than to continue a life of rock and roll." The 1970s had been a decade of contrast for Lennon, the early years of which were characterized by the acrimony of the Beatles splitting and the hedonism of his 18-month-long Lost Weekend, during which he and Yoko separated and Lennon joined the ranks of Hellraiser's Harry Nilsson and Keith Moon as a habitual drinker and drug taker. So Lennon's return in 1980, after 5 years of domestic normality, represented the rebalancing of numerous aspects of his life and his reemergence to the music industry on his own terms. John and Yoko often made decisions using tarot cards, and one such reading in the spring of 1980 told them that John was to take a long journey southeast. At the time, Lennon, Ono, and Sean were living in Long Island, New York, from which the island of Bermuda lies 700 miles southeast. The family settled on Bermuda as their destination and home for the summer of 1980, and most notably of all, John and Sean made the journey by sea. On the journey, Lennon, as the least experienced sailor, spent much of the time making food for the rest of the crew. But the story goes that after a battling gale had laid many of the more experienced crew down with seasickness, Lennon took the helm, guiding the vessel through the storm. This was reportedly a transformational and cleansing moment for Lennon. The family encountered a stable and hospitable environment in Bermuda, allowing Lennon to recapture his creative muse during the 2 months he and his family remained on the island. It was in Bermuda that Lennon would begin to write his first songs in 5 years, tragically also the final material of his career. One thing that Lennon's past half-decade had been missing was nightlife, and the songwriter's familiarity with contemporary music had certainly waned during his hiatus. Exploring the night spots along Front Street in the city of Hamilton in Bermuda, Lennon claimed that he stumbled across a young group dancing to music he'd never heard before. The song in question was Rock Lobster by the B-52s, released in April 1978. In his final interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon claimed that he had never heard the song before, but said that it immediately made him think of Yoko's music. Ono was more familiar than her husband with the movements that had emerged in popular music in the late 70s, and the realization that things were changing apparently gave Lennon the inspiration he needed to begin writing music again. He started playing the guitar again the very next day.
And that's about when my life changed, really.
Not only was Bermuda important in the final year of John Lennon's life in that it helped him return to music, but it also helped him break new ground in his creative process. He was now writing music for the first time in his adult life without the aid of either drugs or alcohol. One of the songs written in Bermuda addresses this aspect of Lennon's changing habits directly. Cleanup Time, which would be recorded in the fall of 1980, is a title derived from a conversation Lennon had with the producer Jack Douglas. The two discussed how many of their friends and acquaintances were attempting to clean up their acts after the excesses of the 1970s. Lennon came back from Bermuda re-energized and ready to emerge from a self-imposed hiatus. Packing his first collection of new material in half a decade, Lennon began to assemble the team of musicians and producers who would help him turn the rough ideas he'd outlined in Bermuda into studio takes for his return to mainstream music. However, the newly well-balanced Lennon was not out to prove anything. Instead, his attitude was just to enjoy the process. Studio sessions began at New York's famous Hit Factory studio. The sessions also included many songs written by Yoko Ono, some of which Lennon would include on the Double Fantasy album. The nature of Lennon's comeback was writ large in the title of his first single in 5 years. Just Like Starting Over is a sweet single that adequately reflects the unity of his relationship with Ono in the years preceding its release. The song's opening bars evoke the theme of rebirth and the trepidation of returning to something, in this case the music scene, which is not as familiar as it once was. The song is in fact constructed from 3 fragments, with the first section, originally titled My Life, emerging in 1979 as a love song that John had penned for Yoko. 2 unfinished pieces, previously known as Don't Be Crazy and The Worst Is Over, make up the remaining parts, while the song only came together in its final form once Lennon and Ono had begun working in the studio in New York. On release, the singles peaked in the top 10 in both the UK and the US singles charts, marking an end to Lennon's self-imposed hiatus and signaling that he still had a receptive following as an artist. The single was to become his biggest solo hit in the US after his death. The studio sessions in New York yielded an album within 2 months, the same period of time that Lennon had spent rediscovering his creative energies on the island of Bermuda. Double Fantasy, released November 17, 1980, echoed the structure of how the songs were first written and shared between John and Yoko, in which a song sung by one of them would influence the other to respond with another song. So in the track listing, you have Lennon singing I'm Losing You, to which Ono responds with the song I'm Moving On. Despite such tensions providing much of the drama of the album, the lyrics are permeated with images of cozy domesticity and marital bliss, which many reviewers at the time took issue with. In fact, the response to the album upon its release was, to put it mildly, mixed, with the record's domestic themes and Lennon's apparent happiness being bones of contention for many critics. In hindsight, however, these revealing elements have come to show Lennon's state of mind in his final days, and tragically, Double Fantasy seems to suggest that by 1980, Lennon may have finally found happiness. From the breakup of the Beatles in 1970, John Lennon and Paul McCartney had had a tense and rocky relationship, beginning with the two taking shots at one another on records and in numerous early solo interviews. Lennon had taken issue with some of the lyrics on Paul and Linda McCartney's 1971 album Ram, which he interpreted as being about his relationship with Yoko Ono. McCartney would later confirm to Playboy that the song Too Many People was indeed about John and Yoko, and that the latter's name was in the original lyrics before being edited out. On John's side, the vicious How Do You Sleep from Imagine, released the same year as Ram, could hardly be about anyone else. By the mid to late 70s, however, the duo had begun to mend their friendship. The pair had reunited only a couple of times since, once in 1974 and again in 1976, when they spent an evening together watching an episode of Saturday Night Live in which Lorne Michaels jokingly offered the Beatles $3,000 to appear on the show. The two joked about turning up at the studio. Lennon and McCartney last spoke on John Lennon's 40th birthday, October 9, 1980, a phone call that McCartney later described as happy. On the day of his death 2 months later, Lennon reportedly told journalist Dave Sholin that McCartney was, quote, like a brother.
We have communicated over the phone in the last year, Paul and I, often.
It seems that John Lennon's claim that he and Yoko Ono had something to say on their return wasn't just empty rhetoric. If anything, it was as if the well of words had refilled itself in the years that Lennon had been away from the spotlight. In addition to the songs and musical ideas, the idea that Lennon had rediscovered his voice in Bermuda is also evidenced by the slew of interviews and public appearances that Lennon made in the months before his death. In September, the couple gave a long interview to Playboy that covered all aspects of their careers, from the early days to what their working routines were like in 1980, as well as their family life and opinions about Lennon's former bandmates and contemporaries. On Friday, December 5, 1980, 3 days before his murder, Lennon was interviewed at his Upper West Side apartment by Rolling Stone editor Jonathan Cott for a full 9 hours. The interview was only published years later. Instead, Cott tragically ended up writing Lennon's obituary, drawing on impressions of the musician from over a decade of wide-ranging interviews and meetings. The horror of Lennon's murder, which was committed publicly in front of his wife by an obsessive fan who he'd spoken to and signed a record for earlier the same day, requires no detailed explanation. The tragedy of his death at the age of 40, in the light of what we know about his life immediately beforehand, is, however, worth talking about. Lennon was publicly active at the time, promoting a new album, meeting fans, and returning to the studio to work on more music when his life was taken from him. Having taken steps to address aspects of his life, his past behaviors, and his turn away from music in favor of family, the truth is that perhaps, as many of his interviews in 1980 show, Lennon's life was perfectly balanced and he was approaching music and fame on his own terms. And the peaceful space that he had created for himself and his family in his hiatus allowed him to think about his future, a far cry from the Beatlemania days when life was moving fast at the behest of managers and executives. The outpouring of grief following Lennon's murder made his final album a massive commercial success, and it eventually won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Lennon's death meant that the album's intimate themes and lyrics became insights into his final months, while for many, the Grammy that the album received stands as a memorial to an artist who just wanted to keep creating. Just Like Starting Over hit #1 in both the UK and US after his death, staying at the top of the Billboard 100 for 5 weeks.